Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Purgatorio by Dante Alighieri. Now, this is the sequel to Dante's most famous work, the Inferno, and is part 2 of Dante's epic poem, the Divine Comedy. Now, I already reviewed Dante's Inferno back in 2021, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out that review. Now, it's believed that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy sometime between the years 1308 and 1320, and it was primarily written when Dante was in exile from his home city of Florence due to his political activism, because he was a very outspoken critic of Pope Boniface VIII and was part of a group of Florentines who opposed the Pope and felt that the Pope had too much power. And he was basically threatened with execution if he ever returned to Florence, so the Divine Comedy was really written from a place of pain and anger, and I think you primarily see that anger in the Inferno, but the anger definitely does bleed through a little bit into Purgatorio. Now, one of the things I love about the Divine Comedy is there are so many different ways to read it. Now, if you just look at it on the surface, it's this fantasy epic about this man, basically Dante himself, going through the afterlife. But if you consider what was going on in Italy at the time and what actually happened to Dante, the whole work is really this political protest against not just what happened to him, but what Dante felt was happening to his homeland, and really the whole work is also sort of this social critique about things that were pissing Dante off about society. And also, Dante being a Christian, it very much is a work of Christian literature, and in a way is almost Dante's thesis on man's relationship with God. And it's also a deeply personal story about Dante confronting his inner demons and confronting his own sins and ultimately affirming his own faith. Now, you don't have to be a Christian or even religious at all in order to enjoy the Divine Comedy, because in general it's just a really great piece of poetry and a really great piece of literature, and it's an important piece of literature too. Like, the Divine Comedy is definitely one of the most important pieces of at least Western literature. Now, I'll be lying if I said the Inferno wasn't my favorite part of the Divine Comedy, but if you just read Inferno, you are doing yourself a disservice. You really should read the whole work. So the plot of the Purgatorio is it picks up where the Inferno left off. Now, in the Inferno, Dante was guided by the spirit of the poet Virgil through the 9 circles of hell, and in order to get out of hell, they had to climb down the body of Satan himself, and then ultimately ended up in Purgatory, which in Dante's vision is described as this mountain that ascends to the heavens. Now, Purgatory is still a place of punishment, but unlike hell where the punishment is eternal, in Purgatory there is at least some hope of redemption. Purgatory is basically for sinners who repented before they died, so there at least is hope of them getting to heaven, but in order to get to heaven they must be cleansed of their sins first. So Virgil guides Dante through Purgatory, which, much like hell, is broken up into different levels. The first level is called Anti-Purgatory, which is for people who were excommunicated from the church, or people who died violent deaths without receiving last rites. But sort of the main part of Purgatory, like the main part of this mountain, is broken up into different terraces, each one dedicated to one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, before entering this part of Purgatory, Dante is confronted by an angel who carves these P's into his forehead. The P stands for, I think the word is peccatin, which I think is the Latin word for sin. So Dante and Virgil ascend this mountain, and with each terrace that they go through, Dante is cleansed of a different sin, and then ultimately they reach the top of the mountain, which is essentially the Garden of Eden, and is the gateway to heaven, and there Dante is confronted by Beatrice, who is a young woman who Dante was in love with, who died when she was very young. Now, Beatrice is based on a real person, although it's actually debated how much Dante really knew this person in real life. Now, Purgatorio does not get talked about nearly as much as Inferno does, especially not by modern readers, and I kinda understand why. I feel like Inferno, oddly enough, despite being way more violent and way more gruesome, Inferno I actually think might be a lot more accessible to modern readers because of all the horror elements. Like, I feel like with Inferno, even if you don't completely understand the historical context in which the book was written, and even if you don't completely grasp all the religious, mythological, or historical references in that poem, you could still enjoy that book as a horror story. And oddly enough, I feel like Purgatorio might be a little more esoteric, if that's even the right word in this context, for modern readers. Although recently I've come across some people online, and even people I know personally who have read the Divine Comedy, who are like, you know what? Purgatorio is actually a pretty damn good book. And I actually think those horror elements from Inferno do bleed through into Purgatorio. Yes, Purgatorio is a little more hopeful, but there's still suffering in Purgatory, and some of the punishments that the sinners in Purgatory have to endure are pretty horrific. Like, the envious have their fucking eyes sewn shut. Like, it's not a permanent punishment. Eventually these people will make it to heaven, but in a way that makes it kind of creepier in ways that I'm not sure if Dante intended. Because it reminded me of how in real life you have certain religious fanatics or some cults who put themselves or their followers through these horrific self-punishments because they feel like that's what will please God. Like, in a way it made the punishments of Purgatory feel almost a little more sinister in ways that I know Dante didn't intend, because the entirety of the Divine Comedy was meant to be a glorification of the ways of God. But we have to keep in mind that this poem was written in the Middle Ages. So, certain things that might appear barbaric to us looking at it from a 21st century perspective might not have appeared barbaric to a man like Dante living in medieval Europe. There are also these bizarre, surreal dream sequences that Dante has in the book, which is interesting because the story itself is already set in arguably a surrealistic world. But despite all the creepy shit that is in this poem, it is hopeful, and it does have a pretty powerful message about redemption and confronting your own sins and your own personal wrongdoings, which I think anybody can relate to regardless of what you personally believe. And I also really liked Dante's relationship with Virgil, and there's this moment towards the end of the poem when Dante has to go through the final terrace before he makes it to the top of Mount Purgatory, which is for the lustful, and he has to go through this fire. Now, Virgil does not have to go through the fire with him, but chooses to so Dante doesn't endure the punishment alone, and I thought that was a pretty sweet and actually pretty powerful moment. And it's a testament to how much Dante and Virgil's relationship developed between this and Inferno, where in Inferno, Virgil was very cold to Dante and actually didn't think Dante was worth it, and Dante had to prove his spiritual worth to Virgil, whereas in this, Dante and Virgil do become friends, and it's actually really melancholy at the end when Virgil has to leave Dante's side. I also think Beatrice is a fascinating character, especially for a female character from a poem written in the 14th century when, let's be real, women did not have a very high status in society, and certainly if you look throughout the entire Divine Comedy, how Dante depicts some of the other female characters is certainly dated by today's standards, but we have to keep in mind the book is 700 years old. But Beatrice in the story, when we meet her, she is an authority figure, basically. Like, she's more than just Dante's muse. Like, Dante basically makes her the voice of God. Like, for a female character from a story this old, she has... I'm not sure if you can say she has her own agency because she is serving a higher power, but again, she's not just some damsel in the story. She's not just some love interest. She's a very, very important character, and like I said, she is kind of an authority at the end to Dante. And in a lot of ways, she's the one who saves Dante by commissioning Virgil to guide Dante through hell and purgatory. Like, it's the exact opposite of what they made Beatrice in that stupid video game that was based on Dante's Inferno from a few years ago, where Beatrice literally was a damsel in distress that Dante had to rescue from hell. But yeah, if you've read the Inferno, I definitely recommend giving Purgatorio a read. Now, after this, Dante concluded the Divine Comedy with the Paradiso, which is about Dante being guided by Beatrice through heaven. Now, the Inferno, which is the most famous part of the Divine Comedy, has been adapted several times. You had the old silent version from 1911. You had another silent film from 1925 called Maciste in Hell, which is loosely based on Dante's Inferno. You had a few other adaptations of Dante's Inferno, like there was an animated comedy version from 2007. Like I said, you had that dumbass video game from a few years ago, which had an animated film. You had the Lars von Trier film, The House That Jack Built, where basically the second half of that movie was a loose adaptation of the Inferno. You had a few comic book adaptations of the Inferno, like there was actually a Mickey Mouse comic from, I think, the 50s called Mickey's Inferno, which was a complete parody of Dante's Inferno just with Mickey Mouse. You had a Swamp Thing comic by Alan Moore, which took elements from Dante. You even had a Godzilla comic that was based on Dante's Inferno, which was completely bizarre. So you've had all these adaptations of the Inferno, but as far as I'm aware, very few adaptations of the Purgatorio. The closest that I'm aware of is I know some guy in like the early 2000s did sort of modern adaptations of the Divine Comedy, including the Purgatorio. I think there have been a few stage productions of Purgatorio. As far as movies are concerned, none that I'm aware of, except for maybe Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain. I actually feel Holy Mountain might have taken some elements from Purgatorio, especially towards the end where you have the main characters ascending the Holy Mountain and kind of being cleansed of their sins and being cleansed of all the things that are holding them to the earth. Now, before I end this video, I just want to cut to my friend Christian Feliciano, who is a regular guest in my videos, giving his thoughts on Dante's Purgatory.
I really love the fact that both Purgatory and prison start with the letter P, because to me, Purgatory really is just like a prison sentence in the sense that you serve your time, you get out, and then you get to be free. You get to go to heaven, chill with the glory. Okay, maybe it's not as similar as prison, because of course prison is different, but at the same time, it kind of is, because you're serving time. You're not there forever. It's not going to be like hell, where you're just locked in hell forever and ever, and there's no freedom, there's no busting out or anything. Purgatory is the idea that you're going to be working off your sins, and the way Dante portrays that is fantastic. I think he does a great job. Now, I don't know, and I could just look this up, but whatever. I don't know if there were legends at the time of Purgatory being like this, like if this is something that people were teaching or talking about, and then Dante just wrote that down, or if he just literally just made this up on the spot. And I'm hoping it is that he just made it up on the spot, because that's just beautiful. The idea that Dante had such a creative imagination that he could just make up this stuff. There's really cool images in it, and to me, that's the best part of the Divine Comedy, the images, the way he describes things. His writing is beautiful, of course. I did not read the original language because there's no way. My brain is just too small. I would just have to look at the words on the paper and just hope for the best. Because, yeah, I just can't. But the translated annotated version that I read is really beautiful. So I assume that that is the original language as well. And he does an amazing job of describing this stuff. And I like the interesting punishments that he comes with, whether it's holding rocks, giant rocks, or being stuck to the floor, which then you think to yourself, the whole idea is you got to keep moving up you have to keep moving up in Purgatory. And the idea that you're stuck to the floor, you can't move, then how do you climb up? I don't know. I don't get it. But, the idea of having your eyes sewn shut, that is creepy. It still continues that idea that this is a very demented, creepy version of Purgatory. This might not be Sunday school Purgatory. And he does a great job with that. I think Dante is one of the greatest writers of all time. I think it's written really beautiful. I think Purgatory is very interesting. There's never a point where I'm bored. You would think, these very old stories are probably stale, boring, slow-paced. Don't get me wrong, it is slow-paced, but it's not slow-paced, like boring slow-paced. It's so interesting to just keep reading and find out all this stuff. The characters are interesting. Dante's interesting. Virgil's interesting. The people that he meets on the way up that's just amazing. I love Beatrice, when she shows up later on in the story. And she had shown up before, and then of course in Paradiso, that's like the big thing. But she, the idea that Dante was in love with her at one point, and it's just fantastic. It's very poetic, and I love it. It's so good, so good. It's not action packed. It's not like that. I remember there was a video game one time of Dante's Inferno. I never played it, but I saw like trailers for it, and I know that I don't know if people think that that's how Dante's Inferno is, but it's really not. But it's fun. It's really interesting to read. If you like Milton, if you like the Iliad, Homer, if you like the Aeneid, you'll really enjoy these books. The Divine Comedy it's a masterpiece. I mean, it is what people say. I hate to sound so cliche, but it is. It's a masterpiece. It's fantastic, and I definitely recommend it. If you enjoyed Inferno and you want to keep going, check it out. I have not read the prose version. I know there is a prose version. But let's say you just really don't want to do the poetry. I'd recommend at least maybe checking that out. Just because, that way you could get the story of it. You could support Dante in some way. I know it's been hundreds of years, but, hey, why not? Why not keep this classic alive? So, yeah. Thank you so much for listening, and bye-bye.